There are lots of good reasons to go with Sega Saturn instead of Pretendo. We call them games. Sega Saturn has tons of them. Pretendo has just a few. It does beg the question, do you want to play or twiddle your thumbs? Face it, Pretendo, you weren't worth waiting for.
Right. Wait, how's it going, guys? Jigger Newman here for Bladeslinger Plays. So, a lot of you guys probably know that before I started doing this channel, I had a blog over on Tumblr, which I haven't really supported as of late, so I'm trying to get back into doing that. But the main reason I haven't is mostly because Tumblr is just sort of fallen off the map as of late, and I've sort of been putting my focus towards the YouTube channel. So, over on my blog, I have a tradition where every year in June, to give myself a break, I take a look at a set of games and do a great big month-long retrospective series. And it started out with Sonic the Hedgehog, then Mario, then Castlevania. But after that, I had a hard time finding long-running franchises that I could fill out the entire month with without each review of the day being redundant. So I came up with this idea to do console retrospectives where every day of the month I pick the noteworthy games from the library and I play one for the 30 days of June. And then at the end of it all, I count down some extra highlights that I didn't get to cover, and as well as what I think is the best of the best in regards of what the console has to offer. I've done the NES, I've done the Genesis, I've done the Super Nintendo, and I've done the Game Boy. And the next console on the list was the Sega Saturn. So in addition to posting this stuff over on my blog, I'm also going to be doing these videos sort of in the vlog format of all the games that I'm covering for the month. It was originally my plan to do some edited videos for you guys, but between getting the console modified and just recording footage for all the games and then editing it, which I'm still trying to figure out how to do, it just became a huge undertaking. So it's going to be vlog format for this year, but next year when I do the PlayStation, I am going to do more official, professionally done videos, because that is something I've been wanting to learn how to do for a while. So anyway, Sega Saturn. It was initially released in November 1994, and it was supposed to be Sega's successor to the Sega Genesis, which was the first console to really give Nintendo a run for their money. Thanks to some clever marketing on Sega's part, as well as some really good games like Sonic the Hedgehog, they were actually able to take half of the video game market from Nintendo, which when the NES came out, they basically had the monopoly on it. So, like, Nintendo was the first one that really showed how to transition to a new hardware with the Super Nintendo, which a lot of people forget was sort of a controversial move when it initially happened. A lot of people didn't understand why they needed to buy another console in order for their kids to keep playing games, not realizing that, you know, technology advances and there wasn't any way to upgrade the NES hardware. So eventually, the Genesis and SNES were going to get phased out, and Sega of Japan was planning to do that for a while. So, but as a lot of you guys probably know, they made all kinds of mistakes with the Sega Saturn, and to be honest, I don't even know where to start. I guess we should start with the hardware itself. So, Sega sort of misread the room on where technology was going at the time. They had it in their head that the next major graphical innovation for consoles is going to be advanced sprite scaling. So they made the Sega Saturn with that in mind. And this was just a completely ignorant move on their part, considering that Sega was the one who was leading the charge with 3D graphics in the arcades. And when Nintendo brought Star Fox to the SNES, and like, it just became very clear that 3D was the way of the future. So when Nintendo announced that the Nintendo 64 and then Sony announced that they would be doing a 3D console as well, Sega hastily reworked the chipset in order to accommodate 3D graphics, and the result was a dual chip setup that would make the console admittedly a 2D powerhouse, but it was notoriously poor at 3D, which was sort of a problem, though a lot of the 2D games that came out on the Saturn were just absolutely gorgeous. This was the era of 3D, and a lot of people felt if a game was 2D instead of 3D that it was dated. So you had games as spectacularly gorgeous as Street Fighter Third Strike, the Alpha games, basically anything Capcom was making, going up against these polygonal 3D games, and people thought that the 3D games looked better, while these gorgeous animations in the 2D games were outdated. Wrap your head around that one. But, and to make matters worse, the dual chip setup was just a nightmare. A lot of people don't realize that when you have two chips, while it might sound like you get twice the amount of programming power, the trick is you have to get those two processors working in tandem with each other and doing their own sort of thing at the same time. And that just took a ton of programming know-how that most third-party developers weren't willing to deal with. Now, that's not to say that third-party developers weren't willing to give it a shot. Companies like Capcom realized that the Sega Saturn was actually very compatible with some of their arcade technology, and that made the console a haven for arcade ports at the time, which was a good thing because they were still very popular in Japan, and that made for good business over in Japan. The Saturn was actually very popular in Japan, and it actually competed evenly with the Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and all those consoles while it was over there in Japan. However, when it comes to the States, that's where the real issue started. So, first of all, Sega of America was hesitant to abandon the Genesis. They had just dropped the price, they had just started selling the console with Sonic, and the console was, finding a second life, which was crazy because, people felt that the hardware was dated and was time for something new, but they had plenty of studios that were really pushing what it could do. So when Sega of Japan started prepping for the Saturn, Sega of America was very much against it. They thought the console was underpowered, and they figured it wouldn't be able to keep up with the PS1 and N64, so they were resistant to it from the start. And to make matters worse, Sega of Japan made a lot of really stupid choices that sort of bungled the launch of the Sega Saturn in America. They burned a lot of goodwill with consumers with the cheap Genesis add-ons like the Sega Saturn and Sega 32X and the Sega CD, which were quickly put in place by Sega and then immediately abandoned. Like for the 32X, there were only like 40 games before the thing bit the dust. So because of that, a lot of people were afraid that if they picked up the Saturn, it would be abandoned pretty quickly. So that definitely hurt the game and the console in the long run. In addition to that, Sega of Japan was concerned about the PlayStation. The Saturn released before any of the other consoles in Japan, and it did very well, but when the PlayStation released, while it didn't sell as well as the Saturn did, it was very quickly catching up with that console. So in order to combat that and get a head start in America, they opted to move up the release. So at E3 of 94 or 95, whenever it was released in America, Sega actually shadow dropped the console at that E3, saying that it was released immediately at select consumer outlets. Now, this was a terrible marketing move for a number of reasons. First of all, after the 32X, a lot of people were not prepared to actually put the money down on the Sega Saturn. So the console came out and they couldn't afford it. And in addition to that, consumer outlets were upset. KB Toys would actually adopt a anti-Sega policy after this. They never carried the Saturn, and they never carried any of the games because they were upset they didn't get any of the Saturn at launch. And so they would get an early lead on the PlayStation. Like, as soon as the PlayStation was released, that lead disappeared almost immediately, and then it was further buried by the N64. It's telling that when the announcement of the Sega Saturn was made, the Shadow Drop, like, it was listed at, I think, $399 for the price, and next up to present was a guy from Sony who had this whole entire speech planned for to hype up the PlayStation. But after seeing what Sega had done, he just threw it all away, approached the podium, looked everyone square in the eyes, and said, $299, and then walked off the stage. It's the equivalent of a mic drop in the gaming industry. So yeah, and the troubles just continued from there. Western development was a joke. There was never a dedicated Sonic game for the console. A lot of the best games from Japan were never localized. Japan was actually, at times, seemed to be actively sabotaging Sega of America. And before long, the Saturn was just doing so poorly in America that no matter how well it was doing in Japan, there was just no way for Sega to make a profit on it. So in 1998, I believe, they announced that they were discontinuing support for the Saturn and were preparing for the Dreamcast. So in the years that have followed, the Sega Saturn has become a case study in how not to release, how not to phase out consoles, and how not to support a console. Like, Sega just did everything wrong with the thing. So you might be wondering, is there a point to looking at the Saturn? And yeah, there is. Though the console was a huge failure, like, there were still a lot of really good and really unique games for the console that even today you can only play on the Sega Saturn. So it's definitely worth digging into the library, which is why I was so excited to do this retrospective. I went out and I bought a Sega Saturn, and then I had my guy at Software Seconds do a MODE modification, which is basically where they rip out the CD drive and put an SD card reader in it with all the ROMs for all the games in it. So even though it cost me a pretty penny, I was able to attain basically the entire library of the console and play it on hardware, which was a lot of fun. And now that I've had time to sink my teeth into the greater library, I'm here to present my findings. So I hope you'll join me for the month as we explore the Sega Saturn retrospective. We're going to begin start tomorrow, and I'll see you then.